Joining us this week on the show is the creative team behind the ongoing Image Comics series, The Infernals, which centers around a potential interfamily struggle for demonic power with an impending apocalypse just over the horizon. I am pleased to welcome Noah Gardner, Ryan Parrott, and John J. Pearson onto the Oblivion Bar Podcast. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having us.
It's a nice intro, by the way. Very cool.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. We recently redid our entire musical slate, all of our transitions, our intro, outro, all of it. And we told the person who created it, which is Dream Kid, I don't know if we have any TikTokers out there, but Dream Kid created everything. And we just told him, do like a 1980s synthy horror inspired type of sound. And that's what they came up with. We loved it.
Oh, they nailed it. And if you can get Ryan Parrott dancing, you're doing something right. Yeah, man.
I have all this recorded, so I'm going to post this on all the socials. Ryan Parrott dancing to our intro music.
Yeah. Your Rogue Sun sales are going to go through the fucking roof, man. Yeah.
Well, honestly, this is very cool for me specifically because we talked a little bit before we started the recording here. The Infernals, which is kind of the basis of our conversation here today, is the first issue comes out here. I have it down here. It's coming up here soon. It's Valentine's Day. We have the Infernals #1 coming out on Valentine's Day, which is very exciting. Just a little under a month away, and I think it'd be fun to just kind of start off with the synopsis. That way, just kind of a set of base here. So, the Infernals is a 5-issue series that revolves around Abe Morgenstern, an Antichrist who is dying and must decide which of his 3 children will inherit his throne. But will Abe ever be able to truly cede control of the apocalypse, or does the Antichrist have something else up his sleeve? So, Ryan, I'd love to start with you. You've spent the better part of this past decade curating this kind of neat, polished corner in the medium, with successful runs on Power Rangers and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Rogue Sun over in the Massiverse. So my question for you is, what is it about this story with its more sinister and grimy approach that compelled you to want to tell it?
Mostly Noah, being honest. I've done a little bit of the darker stuff. I did a little bit with Dead Day, so I've been a little bit more of the macabre and fun, and I've always loved horror and sort of darker tone stuff. It's just been, luckily, I got hired in a lot of places that were super fun and sort of nostalgic childhood storytelling. But when Noah and I have known each other since Bad Robot. We both were assistants there, and we've always wanted to work together. And we've done stuff in film and TV before, but this was the first time that we were found to have some ideas for comics, and Noah came to me with this idea, and it's one of those ideas that when you hear, you're immediately like, someone else has to have done that. It's just too easy. It's too much fun. And so when we realized, oh yeah, this is sort of a new take or a new approach to some familiar territory, it just felt like there's just so many interesting characters and such a weird world that it just felt like too much fun to do. And also, I think, when you do Power Rangers for 100 issues, you want to be able to drop some F-bombs occasionally and some stuff. Not in that world, thankfully, but it was nice to be able to find something that was a little bit that gave us allowed me to use my entire repertoire for my vocabulary.
Well, sure. And Noah, while we're kind of on the topic here, you've been thriving over in Hollywood, cutting your teeth as a screenwriter. You're kind of the fresh blood, the new kid on the block here with the comics medium. What was it about comics that compelled you to want to get with Ryan and tell the story with the Infernals?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I tell the guys all the time, I didn't really grow up with comics. I came to it probably a little bit later, which is probably why I'm so sort of eager and enthusiastic. It hasn't been, squeezed out of me yet, but I was just I was falling in love with the medium, and I was falling in love with the kind of stories you could tell, and the range of stories you could tell, and the range of genres that you could explore and combine. And there are things about my career in film and television that are pretty restrictive in terms of what kind of stories will sell, in terms of what kind of stories I can work in. And so I don't know, it felt like a kind of freer environment. And so much of what I do is kind of locked in the sort of studio silo, you know what I mean? Where everything is just it's in development forever. And so there was the appeal of comics in that regard also, where it was for better or for worse, this is going out there. You know what I mean? And you're going to be working with an artist, and they are going to be rendering your ideas. And what a fucking thrill after spending 8, 9, 10 years primarily working with the input of, and this is not to say I don't love some of my studio executives and some of my producing partners and things like that, but it's like to get out of the development phase and into the active storytelling phase and sharing something with an audience, that was a really exciting prospect. But it really did start with just, I'm a fan of the medium from a from a craft standpoint. There are some things that you can do in comics that you absolutely can't do in features and television. There are some parts of comics writing, just the craft of it, that are a little bit more, I wouldn't say more restrictive, but it's different. It's a different rhythm. And you're telling this, you're sort of telling, it's a more fragmentary storytelling because you're working within panels. And I've actually found, sort of paradoxically, that some of the more restrictive components of the medium, like writing in panels, are actually some of the more liberating too, because you can do all of this sort of experimental shit within a panel. So it was really stretching my legs, and it was a creative challenge. And the way I sort of liken it is I was, playing rhythm guitar in a rock band for 10 years, and now I get to go play some jazz, and I may not know how to play the saxophone, but I'm out here fucking tooting away. So I'm trying, and
that's the
it's
fun
been
of
a lot of
jazz,
fun,
right? Though, isn't it? Yeah, jazz is a little like chaotic and kind of
and
crazy all over the place.
Yeah, and if it sucks, I just get to say, well, it's the notes you're not playing.
Exactly. You just don't get it.
You just don't get it. You're just not sure how jazz is supposed to work. But no, I really, this is it's an interesting creative challenge, and having worked in the same media for 10 years, it's just, what a pleasure to try something new.
Well, while we're kind of on that, if you don't mind, I know people listening to this probably already know this, but screenwriting and scripting for comics, the formats are kind of similar, although obviously the storytelling is different. But like, how was that transition for you in terms of curating the story for Infernals? How was that different as a screenwriter transitioning over into comics?
Yeah, the mechanical differences are both minimal, but also like deeply significant. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where the rhythm of a page is much different. The amount of information you're conveying on a page is much different. The amount of scene you are getting through in a page of comics is much more than a page of film and television usually. So yeah, there were some sort of mechanical and logistical hurdles, but that's one of the million reasons why it was so helpful to have Ryan as my co-writer here, someone who really knew the ins and outs of the medium and could help me sort of find my footing there. But yeah, I would say the sort of pacing of it was more, getting a feel for the pacing was more challenging than the actual sort of minutia of how to format a page and stuff like that.
He's horrible. He refuses to use Cambria font. He doesn't use the proper spacing. No, I'm kidding.
No, are you a Comic Sans guy? Are you like
no, God no.
Type 13.
I only write in sand font. Yeah.
Wing nuts, or what is it? The thing, the wing dots, or just all symbols. Yeah, I can't remember. Yeah. No, I'm kidding.
Well, John, we haven't heard from you yet, and I wanted to bring you in here on this point because I've heard you mention before that there's a certain amount of like rawness to the early 90s Vertigo era of comics that really inspired you. You've been in comics for roughly around 6 to 7 years from what I understand.
Yep.
And, I can definitely see that. I think readers will see that here, especially with this first issue of the Infernals. Kind of along those lines of the Vertigo era of comics, are there any particular titles, again, whether that be Vertigo or otherwise, that kind of come to mind when you think about the bar that you were trying to set personally with your artistic vision within this story?
I think it's Vertigo is a good kind of touchstone for the Infernals. I think tonally in terms of the overall story that we're trying to tell, but I think artistically it's not necessary. Like Vertigo never really had like a house style. It had like a tonal house style, absolutely. But I think for me, like growing up, it was, I think, things like 2000 AD that really had a huge impact on me. Seeing artwork that actually felt real and raw, and it wasn't cartoons. It had an intensity to it, and it conveyed this emotional maturity that I just wasn't used to. And it's really stuff like that that stuck with me as an artist. So when I kind of got more into comics and I was reading stuff, it was things like Dave McKean's Black Orchid, kind of Hellblazer, but then Preacher as well. And stylistically, they're quite different, but tonally, that's kind of what I've always wanted to go for. But yeah, it was always, I think, a lot of the British artists, and that's not just bias. That's just kind of some of the best stuff that is kind of piqued my interest most of all. But then I've gotten more into stuff, things like the Epic imprint from Marvel, kind of in the 80s, early 90s. That was huge. So Sienkiewicz on Lecture Assassin and Stray Toasters, that's always been something that's stylistically what I want to go for. So, yeah, so with the Infernals, it's trying to have that intensity and rawness, where it feels real, but it feels kind of a little bit too real sometimes, but it's got that intensity of emotion. And I think that fits really well with what Noah and Ryan are doing as well in the script, where they've got this outlandish kind of drama set in hell that is both bombastic and nuanced and personal. So it's a pleasure to be able to switch between those things stylistically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it really interesting. The Vertigo era of comics, I think, is so influential and still very present in today's comic world because of how opposite of how style was. You know, how style is always changing, and it is of its era. Whereas, you know, Vertigo, it was all very creator driven, and like you said, very kind of like of its own in a lot of ways. And I think when I first heard of the Infernals, I heard that you were attached to it, John, I immediately thought, like, this has to have been something that came from you, because it just, I feel like it speaks so closely already to what you do so well. And when I, you know, doing research for this conversation, found out that this kind of came from the minds of Noah and Ryan, I thought, I mean, they hit it on the head, you know, like getting John Pearson for this. Wow. Like, kudos. And, you know, kind of along those lines, and this can go for either Ryan or Noah, whoever wants to kind of jump in here. When you brought this story to John, what was it, you know, specifically about his work that really cemented him for both of you for being the right artist for the series?
I mean, well, first off, I think you're exactly right to give us the credit for John's artwork and his contributions to this project. No, I mean, I think honestly, a lot of what John said are the reasons that we went to him first. First off, we didn't think there was a chance in hell, no pun intended, that he was going to say yes to this, but it really was. It was the dream. We were talking to each other and we were like, who's the paradigm here? Like, who's the ideal version of this to bring this to life? And it was like, okay, well, we found this guy, John Pearson, and I'd seen his work in the Razor Blades collection. That was in that anthology. I'd seen that. That's when I first sort of latched onto it. And Ryan, you'd seen his work some other places too, right? I believe.
Yeah.
His name came up very organically. I think what it was stylistically that drew us to his work was exactly like he said, this kind of convergence of like abstract, expressionistic, deeply emotional, deeply intense work with the kind of well-crafted, almost photorealistic at times characters and shapes. And it was like, okay, so at once this is incredibly hyper stylized and visceral and feels like you're really feeling the art. It is that expressionistic, but at the same time it is sort of has this textured, grounded feel to it. And when you're dealing with themes like gods and demigods and metaphysical presences and good and evil and all these sort of large-scale concepts that are at once both very abstract and deeply human, what better amalgam of art style would you possibly want? And so, I mean, really, that was, I think, what attracted us to his work.
It's funny you asked this because I literally was looking through some emails last night and I found August 16th and it says, "Hey, what do you think about John Pearson?" I was like, "We'll never get him." Literally that.
Yeah.
And he's like, "I'm gonna try anyway," and I'm like, "Okay." And then I can see the actual email with John responding, and I'm like, "Wow, that's exciting." So like, yeah, that's how I thought. I was very much like, "Yeah, sure, no, never gonna happen."
Yeah, so I find that hilarious because it's like, I mean, Lady Senkrus, it's like, this is like perfect for me. It's like,
that's
ticks
awesome.
all my boxes. It's like all of my interests. So it's, yeah, like when it came through, I was like, fucking yes. This sounds great.
And it was too cool. We really have to, take a moment to praise the work that John has done, because like when Ryan and I first started having this idea, we were going back and forth, and we could sort of sense we were onto something because we kept wanting to talk about it, which rarely happens, and it didn't feel like work. But it was in a sort of nascent abstract phase until we got, John to say yes and start to engage and tell us what his plans were and show us some of his designs. And then, of course, the rest of the story starts to fall into place. And so, we really have to give credit where it's due, because none of this exists in its current form without John.
Yeah, John, I'm going to keep buttering you up for just a quick moment here, because throughout this first issue, I think we see at least 2 to 3 different art styles that you just masterfully execute. I think very specifically to the Bee's introduction into the story. I think a lot of folks are really... I've heard a couple of different conversations that you guys have had with other podcasts, and I think that's often brought up. I'm going to bring it up again here because it truly is kind of like an e-break. Oh, new character. This is kind of her deal. What happens in those couple panels, no spoilers, of course, is very interesting and kind of sets her up really well. And I really love kind of, if I can just kind of briefly take a segue over to our characters within the story. And again, I don't want to give away too much because I want folks to enjoy this for themselves. But I really love the back and forth between Abe and Sam. Sam very much is this like kind of Black Phillip, Baphomet type of, character, kind of almost like like Anchor in the story, often keeping Abe kind of level and kind of being his like old wise sage kind of character. And then you of course have the 3 in very different ways degenerate kids, whether that be Nero, who's kind of somewhat of a loose cannon. You've got B, who's kind of like a quiet, insane person. I don't know how you guys might be able to describe this a little bit better. And then of course you've got Jackal, who I think of the 3 kids we see the least of, in my opinion, but I think I would dare to say that the one I'm most interested in seeing going forward because of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of Jackal being sort of unseen, I think that's very intentional, because he is meant to be sort of a creature of camouflage. He's a shapeshifter, and he's meant to sort of blend into his surroundings. That's sort of how he's survived. That's how he's made it through life this far, and that plays into what his role in the family is. He's a little bit more talented than his older brother, and they each one of them, I should say, and this isn't spoiling much, but each one of them possesses sort of one of these supernatural gifts that their dad does, right? Their dad is able to sort of he has this sort of telepathic ability. He also has a pyrokinetic ability, and he has the ability to sort of shapeshift. And so each one of those gifts has been passed down to one of the 3 kids. And Jackal is the shapeshifter of the group. And so he is somebody who literally and figuratively is figuring out who he is. And his allegiances are kind of torn, and that's something that we're going to continue to explore through the series.
Mm-hmm. John, I would love to kind of come back to you a little bit here. In preparation for the Infernals, once Ryan and Noah had backed up the Brinks truck to your house and said, "Hey, please be our artist on the Infernals," and you agreed, how much research was done for this book? Again, as we had said just a moment ago, this very much feels like your bag, but considering the many pieces of cultural and religious imagery that you, again, masterfully execute throughout this issue, I feel like there has to have been at least a little bit of research involved.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's certain parts in the first issue, especially, where it's more deeply researched. So the first issue is kind of bookended by these 2 set pieces visually, and both of those were quite intensely researched with the purpose of making it feel more epic and kind of larger and to show the scale of the story, because without them it's a smaller family drama. And even though it's set with the apocalypse like looming, it's needed those visuals to make sure it had this global scale. So there's a lot of research into different representations of, so it's kind of wasn't just focused on this American Christian viewpoint completely. It was it was more global and more spanning. But also on the flip side of that, the visuals do lean into a lot of stereotypes, which is intentional, I think, because I think that the first issue as well, it's introducing these characters as the spawn of Satan from hell. But for me, visually, I didn't want to dwell on that too much. So you'll see these huge inverted crucifixes and inverted pentagrams and all this stuff that we're used to from popular culture, just to hit that home. But that also lets me play with a little bit more nuance with the storytelling, with the emotion side of it, and the characterization. So it's cool. It lets me play with something that is a lot broader in terms of the cultural approach, but then I can lean on some of those expectations, so I can do something a little bit more interesting as well.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, I'd love to kind of hear your piece on this as well, in terms of with you and Noah and the writing of the story. How much research was done from your end as well? I'm assuming there was a bunch, but like, was there a specific approach to, I guess I'm trying to figure out how I want to say this, a respect to, religious tendencies in that sense for this story? Or you just kind of like, hey, let's go crazy and make it as, wild as possible?
Research wise, I didn't really need to do much because my mom, we were raised very religious, and like, she would bring us home from church and then tell us and read parts of Revelations and stuff. It was a little dark. But that stuff's all like, so that's all kind of ingrained in me and stuff. So that was easy. But I think when it came to sort of like, I know Noah's done a really good job on sort of bringing in it and stuff, but like in like the second issue, and that's when there's like a really cool garden that I think ultimately brings about like sort of the 9 lords of hell. And so it's like finding those little things, it's sort of like cherry picking the imagery that you want in the moments you want without sort of leaning too much into it. Cause like, you don't want it to be, I don't think this is sort of an indictment on religion. I think we just like using one of the things I've really liked about what we tried to play with is the idea of sort of providing sort of a corporate entity within the world of religion. Like as the story progresses, you'll get to see more of this, like in the same way that it's a succession story, right? And you think about that in regards to sort of the head of the company and all that stuff. But the idea that there's elements of that are sort of interwoven with sort of religious iconography and stuff is fun. There's a moment. That's my turn to spoil everything. There's an amazing moment. It's finally my turn. One of my favorite moments is in one of the upcoming issues is when someone literally does a blood sacrifice to try and contact Lucifer, and when they do that, they get his secretary, which I just think was the funniest freaking thing. That was all Noah's idea, and I just thought that was but I loved that. I loved taking those and spinning them and trying, taking it seriously, making the stakes feel real, but finding ways to play with sort of the absurdity of what's going on in the background. I don't know. Those not too many spoilers. I didn't give away like a lot of
No, not at all. And I think you bring up a lot of good points, because it was, we never were consciously trying to sort of make this an indictment of religion in any way. It was, if anything, more just sort of trying to show how these patterns in our lives, whether it's in family or in organized religion or in our sort of relationship to corporations, to politics, to whatever, there is this sort of worship element. And there are these sort of metaphysical, existential things we're trying to figure out. And we do it through a host of different mediums. So it really was not about religion in any way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I wasn't going to bring up the Succession comp, because I know you guys are going to get that a ton, leading up to the release of this first issue, which again is on February 14th. And, but it's there. I mean, it's very much there. I think, I hope this isn't any type of, not to make a pun, but a damnation towards this series. But I would say if you were to mix up like Little Nicky and Succession, I think we've got a pretty close, is that similar? Am I off here?
I think we went with The Omen, but Little Nicky works too.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I was thinking. So,
yeah.
But, on kind of a more serious note, though, what I find most interesting about, this first issue is that, you three balance these there are different themes throughout this first issue, and I'm assuming throughout the rest of the story. On the surface, and again, I know this is something you're going to hear leading up to the release, but some may attempt to slot this as in strictly a horror book. And Ryan, I've heard you even classify this as a corporate family drama with supernatural aesthetics. So, Noah, if I can have you speak on this for a moment. When attempting to pitch the story to Image or whomever, was there a particular thematic pillar that you like to lean on, when you are telling someone about what the story is?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's not really a theme, but this is about family dynamics. That is really what and particularly between children and their fathers. And, but I think it's about, and we would say this a lot when we were first talking about it, it really is about sort of what you inherit from your parents. It's about the gifts you inherit. It's about the curses you inherit. It's about the traumas you inherit. It's about everything. It is about inheritance, not in the financial sense. And I think setting a story about inheritance with in the context of the spawn of Satan was always very interesting to us, just because it was never, I'd never really seen it approached from that angle. But in terms of thematic pillars, I think another thing that we talked about a lot was just that we wanted every single one of our characters to be having an existential crisis, and setting that kind of story or that kind of web of existential crises, whether it's in the form of Abe, who's literally confronting mortality. He's having one of the biggest existential crises that we can sort of comprehend as humans, set against a sort of incomprehensible existential crisis of bringing forth the apocalypse. So I think being able to sort of match the macro with the micro there is how we like to pitch it.
Sure. John, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, the genre classifications are it's hard to pin down, but I think that's just one of the beauties of it as well. I mean, going back to kind of what we were saying earlier with like a lot of the logo titles, it's you can really classify a lot of those, and it fits firmly in with that. And similar with my approach with the art style, I love horror, so I can play with a lot of horror visuals, but it's not fundamentally a horror. So it allows that flexibility, but it also broadens the scope for an audience, where if you like horror, then yeah, you'll love it. And if you like family drama, then you'll love it. And if you like a multitude of different things, then there'll be something there for you, which is, I think, quite a rarity for a lot of comics at the minute. So hopefully it will tick a lot of boxes for people.
The preacher, I feel like that's the stuff that we talk about when we're trying to figure out the story, is like, yes, it's the Antichrist and his 3 horrible children, but hopefully as you get to learn who these people are and you understand them more, they become less and less of caricatures and more about fully formed people that you sort of understand why they're not necessarily likable, but hopefully you relate and understand why they are.
I think, yeah, and what Ryan's bringing up is this idea of contrast, and not just sort of tonal contrast, but also thematic contrast. And I think that's something that's been kind of integral to this project from the beginning, and it is something, just to go back to an earlier question you had for me, why comics is so appealing, because I think it is one of the mediums where you can express contrast better than just about any other. I think in some ways, by virtue of the fact that you're sort of playing dialogue off of art, there's something that enables you, and you have the opportunity as a writer, not to get too deep into the weeds, but you have an opportunity as a writer to in one panel literally say side by side a caption of what your character is thinking and your character's dialogue. You know what I mean? Like, that is an incredible benefit that you don't get in many other mediums, and it does speak to this idea of comics being a sort of avenue for expressing contrast. And that's something that we've been just pitching from the drop here, is that when it's funny, it's also going to be scary. When it's scary, it's also going to be sad. When it's sad, there's also going to be something else to it, right? And to us, that just kind of emphasizes the richness of the emotion. And to tie all of this together, nobody could bring that to life better than John with his sort of inherently contrasted style. So I think that's a good point, Ryan, and definitely something we leaned on.
Yeah, I think as well, like, I mean, going back to what you said about Preacher, I think that's one of the reasons why I fell in love with that when I was a teenager is you read it and it's like, oh, this is funny and weird and like quirky, but then because of that, you're going into it feeling one thing, and then when it does take that some turn and becomes really emotional and intense, it does heighten it even more. So the idea of contrast, I think it heightens all the feelings that you have for it, and it just like pulls you in even more. Totally. So yeah, that kind of the storytelling element of that, coupled with the art style, trying to do that as well, should hopefully kind of have some kind of impact.
I think that's maybe one of my favorite genre bending combinations is humor and horror. I think they live. I would say, like, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. I feel as though they're like cousins. Like a lot of times, if you, some of us, I'm not going to point any fingers here, but some of us in moments of fear or when they're feeling upset, I'll either resort to humor or I will laugh at it or something along those lines. And I don't know where that comes from. Maybe I need to see someone for that. But I think a lot of times when I'm reading a horror book and there is that added element of like a quick humor, and it happens in this book in the first issue of Infernals, it almost hits like double hard. It's almost like a double bonus hit right there.
Well, completely. I think what John said is exactly right. That, you know, maybe you don't. And I find this because I've definitely seen some horror comedies that I love, but the sort of subgenre of horror comedy has never appealed to me as much as horror movies that have humor in them, right? And I think because what John's talking about is the effect that contrast can produce, because it's producing multiple feelings at the same time, and that in and of itself produces this sort of self-reflection of like, why is this scary? Why is this funny? Why is this? And that elevates, I mean, at least in my experience, the entire experience. But, you know, Chris, to your point, like, yeah, there is a reason why I think we all, in times of whether it's grief or terror, they're often the human response is to laugh. And you know, there is, yeah, of course, there's something to be said for that, and why those combinations of genres are so particularly emotionally effective. I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of television, and just a show that does it incredibly well, which I think is Fargo. I would consider Fargo to have some sort of to have horror elements in there. There are things that are incredibly disturbing and incredibly frightening, but it is all done because, of course, it's descended from the Coen brothers, where these genres can kind of coexist in a way that it sort of elevates its opposite, and that is a really exciting effect to try to produce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of my favorite horror movies is an Australian horror movie called You're Next. I don't know if you guys have seen it or not, but there's this incredible moment where this guy gets shot in the back with an arrow, and like he doesn't he's like running around, and then at one point he reaches behind himself and he pulls the arrow out of his back, and he realizes this much was in his back, and he immediately faints, and it's the funniest fucking moment, because it's just like the real like, oh god, but like there's something about like I think there's something about the fact that like humor is a really easy way to like characters. Like, funny characters are people you can immediately grab onto. You tend to like them more. You can grab, like, there's a reason we all like Jenny Kennedy in the first Scream movie. That's the guy we cared about more than the people. And, or what's his name, Stu, and all those things. Like, those characters, like, we like them. There's like this. If you're funny, we tend to gravitate for it. And so when you make them laugh and you make them laugh, and then you put those people in danger, all of a sudden we're a little bit more invested. And I think there's something about that. I don't know. Maybe it's something about just the way that humor lowers your defenses, and then horror automatically raises it. I don't know. Maybe there's something to that, but I don't know. I do think that there is, when you can do it right, it's just like, like Your Next does a wonderful blend of blending stakes in that movie, and very, very, it has one of the funniest lines I will not say it because it will spoil the movie. But it is a great movie. Highly recommended if you like horror comedies.
Is it your next?
It's not. They do write that on the wall in blood.
Got it. Nice.
Something that I like as well that about the characters that you guys that in the script is that they do horrific things that are funny. So it's not like it's simultaneously hilarious and horrifying. And the one thing that I don't know why it springs to mind, but that scene in Pulp Fiction where they accidentally shoot Marvin in the face, that springs to mind because that is so brutal and so horrific, but so funny at the same time. I don't know whether that's because it's uncomfortable, but the whole scene is just ridiculous. And that's kind of how I view somebody like Nero, for example, like when he's first introduced in the first issue. It's like he's completely horrific. They're all completely horrific, but at the same time, they're funny and somewhat livable. And I feel like that's really hard to do. To me, like that feels hard to write because it's not like, oh, they do something funny and then they do something horrific. It's the same thing.
Well, yeah, that's the crazy thing is that like we in our experience as people, I can't point to too many instances where I had an experience that was literally one emotion, right?
Yeah,
you're you're feeling things sort of simultaneously, and then when you are confronted with instances that sort of reflect the absurdity of existence and the absurdity of our, not to get too Werner Herzog here, but like when you confront the absurdities of life, you can be terrified or you can find it funny. And usually we kind of do some sort of hybrid of the two. I mean, that's certainly been my experience, trending more towards the terrified and anxious, but sometimes I can see the humor in things.
Well, I want to keep just deep diving into our cerebellum here and really identify all of our personality woes, because I don't want to insinuate that anyone here in this conversation has any extreme daddy issues, but I feel the story wants to have like a serious conversation about the lengths that some of us will go to in order to please our parents, particularly our fathers. And what's important too is some of the, sorry, let me go back here. What's important too is the perspective one has on those relationships and how a child will often pull more from these relationships for better or worse without the parent really even knowing otherwise. John, I'd love to kind of get your take on this here. Of the three children, and I would even, you can include Abe in this as well, in this first issue, is there a particular perspective in this story that you latch onto more than any of the others?
See, this is great. So, like, there's a similar question we had before, and the answer that I would give, because you said, is there a certain character that I latch onto more than others? I'm reluctant to say what I said before. So, I would, I love Nero, but I'm not saying I latch onto Nero.
Nero and me. It's like,
yeah. But I feel like, kind of leading on from everything we said, like, Nero is the most outwardly facing combination of like a range of suppressed emotions underneath this kind of egotistical, like outward facing he's just fucking dick, really, like more so than the rest of them. Like there's not really any initially noticeable contemplation, whereas Jackal and B seem more, they're presented more contemplative to begin with, and I think that's why Nero for me is just fun, and it's far more outwardly expressive. I think if there's anyone that I would latch onto, though, which is a different question, it would probably be Jackal, to be fair. Yeah, I think Jackal, just the shapeshifter, kind of questioning their role and questioning themselves, and the rebellious child, but in a different guise, I think. But yeah, so yeah.
Nero, if I can go back really quick to my apt comparison, if I can just say, Nero is the most like the kids from Little Nicky, the two sons that are trying to take over hell. So for everyone listening right now, if you have not read the Infernals yet, just think of Nero as like the third kid in Little Nicky.
Which one's Sandler? Which one's Little Nicky?
I guess Sandler is the other kid. I'm talking about the two bad ones, which I think one of them is, oh man, you're going to make me look up the cast here. But Do you guys know who I'm talking about here? Am I just?
Oh yeah, no. You're bringing me right back to sixth grade.
Ray Fiennes is one of them, and then oh man, who's the other one? Ray Fiennes and the guy from Friday. What's his name? Tommy Lester.
Oh wow, yeah.
But anyway,
good pull, yeah.
But no, I'd love to hear your answer to this as well. Is there a character that you kind of latched onto here in this first issue?
Yeah, I mean, so in the first issue, I'm not sure we fully. Yeah, my experience writing these characters, I really, as we kept going with this series, started to sort of see a comparison between me and B, and I felt myself having a lot of sympathy for her. I think in the first issue, by virtue of the fact that it's Abe's narration, I think Abe is probably the person that I identify with the most, and just knowing what he's going through and his experience resenting his father as he confronts death, and resenting his father for, one, putting him in this position to begin with, and two, sort of not only not protecting him, but kind of killing him in a way. You know, Abe blames his father. He holds his father responsible for getting terminal cancer. Believing, as we all do, that your father has the power to kind of insulate you or protect you from these things that we discover as we go through life they don't have the power to do. But returning to B for a second, she's an interesting character in the first issue. I think she's sort of, we set up that there's a lot of feeling kind of buried, and cleverness and perspective that's kind of buried beneath her outwardly kind of antagonistic and irreverent facade. So I like that about her. But as we've gone through the season and started to sort of flesh out her character more, I really realized that I do identify with her largely because she's the youngest child, and her siblings are a little bit older. And in my family, I was the youngest. My dad had 5 kids, 3 from a previous marriage and 2 from his second marriage. And I was the youngest of the 5, and he had me when he was 61 years old. And so I sort of identified with B as being a kid with an older father, and both which means you have to contend with sort of mortality a little bit earlier. It's just in your space. It's a part of your awareness at an earlier age, which I think is a blessing and a curse. It produces this kind of existential fear, I think, at least it certainly did for me, but it also makes you more aware of the fact that your parent is not God, which is kind of the delusion that we all are operating under until a certain point in our life. And so you kind of have a expedited realization that your parent is fallible. And I think that is a important checkpoint in one's maturity. And so I look at B as actually, even though she acts out of impulse and even though she can be so sort of nihilistic and cynical, she is one of the more emotionally mature characters that we have, and we're going to learn that as we continue through this series. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, how about you?
It's funny, as you asked that question, it made me remember like sort of the early days of sort of writing like issue 1 and issue 2 a little bit, and how I think in those early days with Noah, I kept trying to frame Jackal as the good guy, and what I remember that Noah kept reminding me of is like, he's not a good guy. He's somebody who's trying to sort of play both sides of the fence at the same time. He's trying to, like, he knows what he's doing is wrong, but he thinks if he can do it wrong in the right way, that maybe it's okay. But then why is he doing it that way? Like, this idea that he's sort of straddling the line at all times, I thought was a really interesting thing. And it made me think about the way that I sort of deal with my parents, the way that I deal with my siblings and all that stuff. And so I think I do sort of relate to him in that sense of, like, somebody who his identity is malleable depending on the person he's trying to please at the time he's trying to please them. And I found that sort of something super interesting. Now, that might say way too much about myself on this podcast, but
if there's one theme during this episode, it is expose your underbelly as much as possible.
Yeah. You know, it all started back when I went, you charge $200 a session, right? That's what this is? Yeah, okay.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, that's right. And to be honest, I think during this conversation, you know, we're just over 45 minutes into this conversation. I think we got a lot of good info. I think if people aren't already excited for the Infernals, they should be now. And I want to kind of round out this conversation with you gentlemen to kind of talk about, the other things that you guys are doing, outside of the Infernals. And Ryan, since we're already here with you, I'd love to, if you could you give me like a quick elevator pitch of like, what else are you getting into outside of the Infernals currently?
I can say in comic books what I'm doing. So I'm currently still writing Rogue Sun for Image. I'm hitting issue 19. I think 18 comes out this next 2 weeks or so. That'll be the third volume of that. I have another issue of I'm doing one more issue of Power Rangers Unlimited, the Morphin Masters, which sort of lets me be part of the Darkest Hour thing. Even though I love what Melissa was doing, and it was an opportunity to sort of come back in and do that. And then I have some other creator-owned stuff that's coming up down the pipeline. I can't quite say yet, but will be fun. Sort of some of this similar genre, which is cool. And yeah, that's about it for now. I'm sure there's other things that I'm forgetting about, but those are all the things that my editors are watching this right now going, why is he talking and not writing? So
yeah. Noah, how about you?
Well, back to our previous conversation, so much of what I do in my film and TV career is kept in the sort of top secret studio vault. So most of the film jobs that I'm working on right now, I'm afraid I can't talk about, but hopefully we'll be able to announce in the next year or so. On the TV front, I think there will be a couple of announcements coming out soon, which would be really great. And in this sort of comic adjacent world, I am adapting a couple of comics for the screen, which I'm super excited about. A couple indie books that I love, and hopefully there will be more on that soon as well.
Mainly just this. It takes me forever to draw this. So.
We see that, by the way. We see it in the issue. It looks great.
Yeah, like it's pretty much all the Infernals. I've got a couple of other kind of short things that I can't talk about, that are coming up soon. They're in line with this. If you've seen what I do, you know what I do. And yeah, it's... but yeah, it's pretty much this.
John's working on a children's book after the Infernals.
You know what, funny enough, I'm not, but I would fucking love to do a kid's book, a really creepy kid's book.
Sure.
Like the Babadook.
Yeah, naturally. Babadook, of course, very YA, as most people know.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say before we head out of here too, and I know you guys can everyone listening right now can't see my shirt, but you guys can. It says "fuck cancer" because I actually went through cancer last year, colon cancer, and reading this series, reading the first issue of this series, kind of going into the beginning half of it, learning that Abe has a multitude of different terminal cancers. The reason why I wanted to bring this up is because it kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier, which is kind of like the humor and fear. And I remember when I found out that this was going on, I like inherently laughed because I didn't think the doctor was being serious. And then when I was reading this issue, I remember inherently having that same chuckle when I read what Abe was going through, and it just brought me back. The reason why I tell that story is mostly just for the fact that I think it was Noah, you said this earlier. There's a little bit of something for everybody in this book, and I don't think, I'm not just saying this because you guys are right in front of me. I think that this is going to be a hit. I don't know. I was going to try to find a more romantic way to say that, but I think people are going to get their hands on this and are going to really enjoy it. I can't implore listeners of this show or otherwise to go out on February 14th and pick up Infernals #1. Again, 5 issues from what I understand, and then potentially more down the road, possibly.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not really a betting man, but I will say that once people start reading this, they're going to be demanding it in hordes for this. So, gentlemen, do you have anything else you want to say before we head out here of this conversation?
Just thank you so much for having us and all the kind words, man. Really, really, really do appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much. And obviously, everybody go and buy Infernals Valentine's Day. If not for you, then for your loved ones.
And real quick, again, before we head out, do you guys want to plug any socials? Ryan, how do they follow you over on your socials?
Yeah, I'm only pretty much on Twitter. It's that Ryan Parrott, 2 R's, 2 T's. That's pretty much it.
I'm at Noah G. Gardner. You can join my army of 100 Twitter followers. Really tight-knit group. We try hard.
And I'm just at John J. Pearson on everything. So yeah, come and find me. Yeah. Oh, and you can also support me on Patreon as well, where you can get some behind the scenes glimpses of the Infernals before anyone else. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me here today, and I'm excited for everyone to eventually read Infernals #1.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.